Been telling you guys this was coming, and now it's happening. Right now, this week, the conversation has changed. It started when Donald Trump started talking about a third term again, which, by the way, I am appalled at how many on the left took the bait. Because Trump throws out the absolutely rancid trash idea of a third term when he finds himself needing either a distraction from a failure or from a reality unfolding that he simply cannot allow to be true. So when the left immediately takes his bait and starts panicking about a third term, we are doing his work for him when instead we need to be looking in the exact opposite direction. Because that's where the thing is from which he is trying to distract us. So what's the thing? Is it because he's trying to hide from the crushing increases in healthcare costs? Is it because he's running away from the peace deal that is neither peace nor a deal? Is he trying to change the subject from the fact that everybody thinks he sucks and polls show everybody blames him for the shutdown? No, it is not. It is this. Next week, the Supreme Court is going to hear opening arguments that will decide whether or not he has the power to unilaterally impose unregulated, unlimited, indefinite tariffs on our trading partners. And as they hear those arguments, the Supreme Court is going to have to decide whether they apply the major questions doctrine, which would by default require them to side against Trump. Because in a sentence, the doctrine says that the executive branch cannot assume authority to make decisions that have vast economic or political significance without explicit authorization from Congress. And since the emergency power he's using to claim authority to impose tariffs says nothing about taxes, tariffs, or duties, there is absolutely no logical way that the tariffs he's imposed through this emergency power, which is about 2/3 of his tariffs, could survive the application of the major questions doctrine. But we know the Supreme Court is willing to lie down for Trump. So the question then becomes, will they? That is going to depend on the signals they get from Congress, which is why as Trump again floated the idea of a 2028 term, J.D. Vance actually went to the Senate to try to convince Republican senators to vote against 3 consecutive bills that seek to restrict Trump's tariffs on Brazil, Canada, and the rest of the world. Now, before you say the Senate Republicans would never turn on Trump, remember they already did. They already voted once back in April to cancel his tariffs on Canada. Of course, Mike Johnson wouldn't allow that vote to take place in the House, and Trump would certainly veto it if it got to his desk. But while these Senate bills are purely symbolic, a symbol like the Republican Senate specifically saying, no, you do not have permission to impose tariffs, would be impossible for the Supreme Court to ignore. Which is why Trump both sent J.D. Vance to speak to senators and also why he floated the 2028 threat. Because when you look at this chart of search trends, you can see that basically no one is searching for Vance 2028. Meaning if Trump wants to force these Republicans in Congress to continue to do his bidding, he has to once again resurface the old threat that if they go against him, they won't be able to ride on his coattails again in the future. And wouldn't you know it, they voted against the Brazilian tariffs this week anyway, because the Republicans in the Senate are starting to realize what Marjorie Taylor Greene already understands. When it comes to election cycles, we already live in a post-Trump world. The faster the rest of us get on board with this reality, the faster the Trump agenda becomes thinner than the purple skin on the back of his hand.
Let me say that again. The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real. But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other. Before we figured out there were other people to kill, we just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why.
Okay, so here is the good news and the bad news, and also the completely insane news on Snap. So the good news is that not one, but 2 federal judges have ordered the Trump administration to pay Snap benefits out of the contingency fund that I told you about a few days ago. The judge more or less said in both cases, like, that's exactly what this money is for. So yes, of course you should spend it, because otherwise people will starve, which the Trump administration doesn't seem to think is that big of a deal, but everybody else understands is a 5-alarm fire. Now, the Trump administration, of course, had said we can't spend those emergency funds because we might need them for a hurricane. I'm not joking. That's what they said. We might need them for a hurricane, even though there are natural disasters all around the country that the Trump administration has withheld funding for months and months now because those states voted for Kamala Harris instead of Trump. But now suddenly they have a huge urgency. In fact, look at this quote. As a response to today's rulings by Kevin Hassett, he directs the National Economic Council, very far right. He's an ally of Trump. His response was, we're about to use emergency funds from the Department of Agriculture because of a liberal judge ruling that we disagree with. And he said doing so would mean we don't have our emergency funds in case we have a hurricane or we have an emergency A food emergency. What? So that's the bad news, that MAGAs are going to say that this is not a fair or a just ruling, not a ruling they like, but that a quote-unquote liberal judge made this decision. The big question, though, and the really crazy thing, is that we still don't know, and every article about this has indicated, that we're waiting to find out whether or not the Trump administration will appeal. I want you to take that in for 1 second. We are waiting to find out whether the Trump administration will appeal releasing funds that they first said were illegal to release. Their hands were tied. They couldn't. Now 2 judges have ordered them to. And we're waiting to find out whether they'll appeal, and you know they will, because they don't want to give that food to hungry children that badly. Why? Because then they can't win their fight with Democrats to take away our health care. That's what this is about. And I'll say it again. They would rather starve children than give Americans affordable health care. Or to be even more clear, they would rather starve children than make billionaires part with 1 extra penny of their money. That's today's Republican Party under Donald Trump. And that, my friends, is the real emergency.
A new poll shows that Americans oppose Trump's new White House ballroom by 2-1.
What? No, that's crazy. Guys, this ballroom is gonna be awesome. It's gonna allow up to 1,000 people to fillet the president in exchange for political favors at the same time. And they say the government isn't efficient.
Big enough. Take it, yeah, baby, take it,